Hey guys, it's Chris from Highline Guitars, and you're watching another episode of From the Luthier's Workbench. In this episode, I'm going to pick up where I left off in a previous episode where I talked about level sanding and polish sanding a clear coat finish. And what I'm going to be talking about specifically in this episode is how I buff this clear coat to a really high gloss mirror-like shine using my buffing machine. Now, before I do this, I need to take a close look at the surface of this clear coat finish to make sure that it's ready for buffing. Because if there are any fine scratches still present, those scratches will remain all the way through the buffing process. There's a possibility that some of them could be buffed out, but when you see fine scratches like that, you have to assume they're not going to go away. So I want to make sure that I deal with those. And what I'll do first is I'll hold the guitar up to a bright light. Now on the ceiling I have a pair of 100-watt LED bulbs. They're pretty bright. So what I'll do is I'll hold the guitar right up to my eyes at a very low angle so that I can see those bulbs reflecting off the surface. And I'll inspect the entire surface of the guitar. And what I'm looking for are scratches which appear to stand out against the surrounding surface. Now here's a photo that shows how those scratches appear. It may be a little bit difficult to see in this video. Hopefully it translates over and you can see it. But this is what those scratches look like at first. And this is typically what to expect when you are early on in the level sanding and polish sanding process. But then as I recognize those scratches and continue to work that surface, I'm able to reduce and then ultimately eliminate those scratches completely. Now, as you work your way up through the different grits during the polish sanding process, for example, going from 600 to 800, and then from 800 to 1,000 and 1,000 up to 1,200, you'll notice that with each step up in grit, the surface gets more reflective when you look at it at a very low angle. When you're looking straight down on it, it still looks like a matte sheen, but as you look at it at a low angle, you can start to see some reflectance, and that increases as you work your way up through the grits. And by the time you get to your final grit, you have a pretty decent shine. But if you can see any fine scratches anywhere on the surface, you need to perhaps back down in grit and just work those areas to get rid of those scratches, because once you get to the point where you're ready to start buffing, you want that surface to be as perfect as possible. Now I've already gone over this surface very carefully. I've identified and fixed some of the fine scratches that were still present, and now I'm ready to take it out to the shop and start buffing it to a high gloss mirror-like shine. So let's go out there and get started. Okay, so this is my buffing machine, and I've talked about this before in other videos, but I'm going to go ahead and give you just a quick rundown of the machine's specs. I built this machine myself, and if you're interested in building a similar buffing machine, I offer plans for sale on my eGuitar Plans website, and I'll put a link in the description below, not only for this buffing machine, but for the compounds and everything that I use. And this machine is powered by a 1 horsepower, 1800 RPM motor. And the shaft itself spins at about 900 RPM, and it spins in this direction. So as I'm standing in front of it, it's the portion that I buff with down here from the horizontal center line down. It spins down and away from me. That way, if the body were to catch while I'm buffing, it would throw it down rather than back up at me. And I'm using 14-inch diameter soft flannel cotton wheels. And you can also use like Airway type wheels. In fact, I would recommend an Airway style buffing wheel if you're really new to this, if you haven't done a lot of buffing. I like to use these because I can buff it up to a shine faster. However, you have to be careful because when you're buffing, these wheels when they are in contact with the surface of your clear coat finish, it generates heat, and that heat can cause burn through as well as blistering and that sort of thing if you're not experienced. Once you've got experience doing this, you can actually use that heat to your advantage, but it's a bit of a dicey proposition. So if you're inexperienced, you may want to start out with an airway style wheel. But again, like I said, I'll put links to the wheels that I use as well as airway wheels and such. Now, as you can see, I've got wheels on both sides. On this side, I'm using a Menzerna P204 medium cut compound. And this is what I use to bring up the initial shine. Then I'll switch over to this wheel and I'll use, this is the P175 Menzerna Super Finish. And this is what really puts the shine on the shine. So the medium cut to start and then the Super Finish to complete the buffing process. And then of course, I always wear eye protection and a respirator. Buffing with these solid compounds will produce a lot of finishing, polishing dust in the air, as well as lint from the wheels itself will float around in the air. So it's always a good idea to wear a respirator. And I'll also probably turn on my overhead dust collection system just to clear the air. So let me bring you in closer and I'll show you how I buff up to a high gloss shine.
Now the first thing I've got to do before I start buffing is to tighten all the nuts and bolts and screws that hold the buffing machine together. I don't want anything flying off as the machine is spinning. That's never happened, but that's because I tighten all the nuts and bolts. Next, I like to grab a pair of scissors and do a little bit of buffing wheel grooming. I'm just clipping away some of the fibers that are sticking out, because when those things are whipping around at 900 to 1500 RPM, they'll slap the surface and cause some scratches. So I just like to trim it down, make sure that the edges of the buffing wheel are square with the sides. Then I'll take a buffing rake and rake out any clumps of finish left over from the last time I used the buffing wheel. Any clumps that are still present could scratch the surface when I start buffing. With the wheels groomed, I can then charge them with the Menzerna P204 medium cut compound. Now it's really important not to mix compounds and buffing wheels, or you won't be able to achieve a high gloss shine. I call this first buffing effort pre-polishing, and my technique is pretty simple. I'll use a medium amount of force against the wheel. I don't push it too hard, and I will move the body constantly as I'm buffing because I don't want to linger in any one spot for too long. The heat generated by the friction could damage the finish. And then periodically as I'm buffing, I'll recharge the wheel with buffing compound. I typically use 2 buffing wheels on each side, but to get into tight spaces, I'll take one of the wheels off, and that makes it easier to get into areas like the upper and lower horns. After buffing, the surface is still warm, which makes it susceptible to scratches. So before I wipe it off, I'll hang it up to cool. And then after about 30 minutes, I can wipe off the buffing residue without fear of scratching the surface. The technique I'll use for my final finishing buff is the same as what I use with the pre-polish. I'll charge the wheel with some Menzerna P175 ultrafine finishing compound, and then I'll use a technique that was similar to that pre-polish, in that I will use just a medium amount of pressure against the wheel, and I'll keep the body moving so as to reduce frictional heat. I don't want to risk burning through the finish, which doesn't actually happen very often, but it's something I don't want to risk. Of course, I'll pull off one of the wheels so that I can get into some of these hard to reach areas, like the cutaways on both the upper and lower horns. And then once I'm finished, I like to take the guitar and hold it up in front of a brightly lit window. This is what I call the window test, and it allows me to see reflections and whether or not there's any distortion. I also like to examine the surface under a really bright 100-watt LED bulb in a fixture in the ceiling. This helps me to see any potential fine scratches that may still remain and require additional work.
Okay, guys, well, there you have it. That is the technique and the tools that I use to buff out a guitar's clear coat finish to a high gloss mirror-like shine. And there are a lot of different ways that you can buff a guitar's finish. You know, you can use rubbing compounds, liquid polishing compounds, swirl removers. You can do it by hand. You can use car polishers. You can use a drill with a foam pad, all that kind of stuff. And I've done them all. However, this approach with the big buffing wheels and the Menzerna solid compounds is the easiest and by far the best approach to getting that high gloss shine, especially one without those little fine scratches that can be such a challenge to remove. So that's what I would recommend if you want to get that kind of a shine every single time. So I hope you found this video to be useful. If you've got any comments or questions, make sure you post them down below and I'll do my best to answer them. And give me a thumbs up. And if you don't already subscribe and want to see more guitar building videos, hit that subscribe button, click the bell notification so that you'll be notified every time I post a new video, which is usually a couple of videos a week. And I hope you have a great weekend, great week ahead, and we'll see you soon.